Hello, students. Today we're going to talk about an issue that often gets glossed over in U.S. history textbooks, and that is what happened with labor, particularly freed slaves, after the end of the Civil War until the start of the Civil Rights Movement. So we're looking at a time period of about 90 years between 1865 and the 1950s, 1940s and 1950s. So I just want to give you a quick overview of um, what you're going to be encountering in the documentary that you're going to watch. Go over a few terms and a few effects, and give you a few things that you want to think about, because afterwards you're going to be doing a short reflection on the documentary. So, um, documentary that we're going to watch is called Slavery by Another Name. So during Reconstruction, right after the Civil War, there's this period where there are a series of laws and amendments where slaves are freed from slavery, and there are actually some pretty incredible opportunities that happen relatively shortly after the Civil War. So freed slaves can vote, they start to reform families, they get married, they even go to the first public schools in the country. And we have a series of African Americans being elected to become governors and senators and so on. But even before Reconstruction ends around 1877, we start to see Southern states push back a little bit. We see some violence in the form of things like the Ku Klux Klan, but then also there are some laws that begin to slowly force African Americans back into these systems of forced labor. So if you look carefully at the 13th Amendment, which is the amendment that ends slavery, you'll notice it says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. So there's this exception in the amendment that ends slavery and says you actually can have slaves if it is a punishment for a crime. Now, this doesn't say you can have slaves, right? You can force somebody to do labor as a punishment for a crime. So, what happens is in the southern states, you begin to see these laws that criminalize a lot of things. So, things like vagrancy, loitering, riding rails, changing jobs, or even talking too loudly in public could have a large fine or send somebody to jail. Um, Once in jail, the states would engage in what was called convict leasing, where they would basically rent out convicts to companies for labor. So, example of these laws were the pig laws, probably the most famous ones in like Alabama and Mississippi. And what happens was these laws started to take penalties for crimes that used to be small and make them much more severe. So, for example, the theft of a pig that was worth only about $1 could land you in prison for 5 years. Some people say that the convict leasing system was actually worse than slavery because of the working conditions were so bad. The odd thing is that slave owners, even though they were harsh and very strict, would very rarely kill a slave because slaves were an investment, right? Slave owners spent a lot of money to have these slaves. And so they didn't want to lose that investment. So they, even though slaves might have been whipped, they were generally not killed and they were taken care of. Convict leasing, on the other hand, if a convict died, all a company had to do was go back to the state and get another convict and rent them out, right? There was no penalty. And so the labor conditions in these forced labor situations were very bad, much worse than slavery a lot of times. And this is where you start to see the pictures that we have of chain gangs, right? Groups of prisoners chained together for work. It happens all across the South. Debt slavery is another version of this. Peonage or debt slavery happens when someone was forced to work off their debt with labor. And for those of you who are in U.S. History A, you'll remember sharecropping, right? The practice where a sharecropper agreed to farm the land for a percentage of the sale of the crop. So even though slaves were freed in the South, the plantation owner still owned the land. And so former slaves often got jobs from these landowners as sharecroppers. But what would happen is that these workers became so indebted to the planters through loans and high interest rates that eventually it became to a situation where they couldn't get out of this debt and they were forced to work to pay off this debt. And it was illegal for them to try and find a new job. Sometimes these slave croppers could be, or sorry, not slave croppers, sharecroppers could be forced to work 19 to 20 hours a day without pay if they got too far in debt. So in response, there wasn't a real strong federal response to this. The southern states made a lot of money off of these arrangements, so there was very little incentive for them to do anything to stop these arrangements. There were some attempts at the federal level starting in the early 1900s to prosecute people for these issues, but it wasn't until the beginning of World War II, actually, 5 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, that President Roosevelt started to prosecute people on a large scale for these sorts of issues. It wasn't, in fact, until 1951 that Congress passed specific laws that made any form of slavery in the United States a crime. That was almost 90 years after the passing of the Emancipation Proclamation. So, what was the impact of all this? Well, at the time, during those 80 years after the Civil War, as many as 800,000 people in the South were caught up in one of these forced labor systems. The South State prison population in 1890 alone was nearly 20,000 people, and 90% of those incarcerated were African Americans. And like we were saying, southern states could make the modern equivalent of about $4 million a year just on convict leasing. One historian offers the following interpretation of the impact of all of this. So there are many important implications and long-term consequences for this convict leasing system. Not only is it so oppressive, but when you have an overwhelmingly Black prison population, it cements that relationship between criminality and race in people's mind to the degree that it is seen as something inherent, right? So she's arguing that because so many African Americans were put in jail, people started to see them as it started to change people's perception that this was something natural. It was the way it was supposed to be. Today in the United States has the highest number of people in prison of any country in the world. And despite being only about 13% of the population of the United States, African Americans make up almost 40% of prison populations. When you compare that to white Americans, who are about 64% of the population, they actually make up a smaller percentage of prisoners than African Americans. By the age of 18, an African American has a 30% chance of being arrested, and that percentage goes up all the way to 50% by the age of 23. There are more African American men in prison in the United States than the entire prison populations of India, Argentina, Canada, Lebanon, Japan, Germany, Finland, Israel, and England combined. Those countries altogether have a population of about 1.6 billion people. There are only 19 million African American men in the United States. So some things to consider. Why did it take so long for these systems of forced labor to end in the United States, and why did they eventually end? How might the history of the way these laws were used to force African Americans into labor impact the relationship between African American and law enforcement today? How do you think this history impacts the way law enforcement officials might view African Americans today? How might the high rates of arrest and incarceration impact the relationship between African Americans and white Americans today? And I think the big question that we need to ask ourselves is, why is this information not included in most American history textbooks? Okay, so the next step you're going to do is watch the documentary, Slavery by Another Name, and then answer the review questions that you can find under that video. Good luck, everyone. Let me know if you have any questions.